It's Bullseye. I'm April Wolf. Morgan Neville is a documentary filmmaker. For the first decade and change in his career, almost all the movies he made focused on musicians, people like Iggy Pop, Muddy Waters, Johnny Cash. His breakthrough came in 2013 with 20 Feet from Stardom. It's a touching, really human portrait of the lives of backup singers.
So it was like very late at night, and I was very, a little pregnant. Had curlers and the whole thing in my head, getting ready to go to bed. And we got a call, Mary, there's a group of guys in town called the Rolling Somebodies. And they're from England, and they need somebody that will sing with them. They picked me up with silk pajamas on, a mink coat, and a Chanel scarf on my head.
It was in the middle of the night, and then we thought, well, we would love to have a woman sing this part. I didn't know her, from Adam.
Since then, he's branched out. He covered William F. Buckley and Gore Vidal's televised debates and 2015's Best of Enemies, and he worked on the Netflix food series Ugly Delicious. His latest is Won't You Be My Neighbor, a documentary about the late Fred Rogers, or Mr. Rogers. Maybe you already heard about it. It's the documentary out now that made your mom cry, and if you go see it, you'll probably cry too. Won't You Be My Neighbor is an honest portrait of one of the kindest, most sincere people to have ever lived. He talked with Jesse Thorn about the movie and how Fred Rogers' lessons can make us better people today. But before we get into that, let's take a listen to a little bit from the movie. In this clip, we'll hear from Margie Whitmer, who served as producer for Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. She worked on more than 250 episodes between 1982 and 2001.
We had a director that once said to me, you take all of the elements that make good television and do the exact opposite. You have Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Low production values, simple set, unlikely star. Yet, it worked. Because he was saying something really important.
Love is at the root of everything. All learning, all parenting, all relationships, love or the lack of it. And what we see and hear on the screen is part of who we become.
Morgan Neville, welcome to Bullseye. It's great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
You made a lot of documentaries about rock and roll guys for a guy making a documentary about Mr. Rogers.
He's kind of rock and roll, though.
Oh, really?
Yes.
How's that?
He had such, it's funny to say about Mr. Rogers, such swagger. It's amazing that he was so consistently who he was in every situation he was ever in. And he had this attitude that he was going to try and change the world, and it was radical in that way, radical in the way that he was trying to get to the root of the thing, back to the basics of things. And I think that's how I thought of him, that he was a rock star.
It's almost scary to me, the extent to which he appears to have been the man in his life who he appeared to be on television. I think maybe just because it makes me question the choices that I make in the world.
Well, it's funny. I mean, I think something that I'd say the majority of people expect is to be disappointed. That I had many people, when I told them I was making this film, say to me, please don't destroy my childhood. Basically, please don't tell me there's something that's going to make Mr. Rogers fall from the altar like everybody else has fallen from the altar. And, I didn't go into it with an agenda one way or the other, and it wasn't about that in the first place. But, the big secret about Mr. Rogers is he's one of these rare characters who actually is not only as good as his television character, but actually is more impressive than his television character. But I think it says a lot about us that we have come to view people like that with suspicion, because how could somebody be that good? There must be some other shoe to drop on that. And that, in a way, is kind of a lot of what the film's about, which is how do we think about goodness? You don't call it goodness, you can call it kindness. I think Rogers would call it grace. But those are the kinds of things that people kind of laugh at. Like being kind is like believing in rainbows and unicorns. It's not, it feels naive and quaint in a way. And I feel like that is not how we should think about those things. I feel like Fred was a warrior for kindness, as he says in the film, not Pollyanna-ish stuff, but honest to goodness kindness. That's something that you have to fight for, because we all take it for granted that we're going to live in the neighborhood together, and we can trade against that in how we behave every day. But I don't think we should count on it.
There's a moment in the film, a bit of archival footage of him being interviewed, where he says, "You may think that this opinion is ingenuous." And I was caught short by it simply because I'm so much more used to the negative or contrary form of that, disingenuous.
Yes.
Part of his battle was to say and believe these things in a public way that did not lead people to believe that he was simple-minded or a fool.
It's true. I mean, I think we usually conflate simple with simple-minded or superficial, when, of course, what he was doing was simple and deep. And that is a very different thing. That's where you get into things like love and spirituality, is simple and deep. And that is a tough thing to pull off, because to do that, you have to be honest and open and vulnerable. These are things that people don't like to do publicly. And it's something he did again and again and again. It's something I felt like I personally learned a lot and just thought a lot about in making this film, was the value of putting yourself out there emotionally and just embracing sincerity in an era where there's not a big premium on sincerity.
There's a scene in the movie, a clip that I remembered actually very vividly from my own childhood, of Mr. Rogers talking to a kid who is 6 or 7 years old and had a tumor on his spine. And when the tumor was removed, it had damaged his nerves, and he had lost a substantial amount of control of his arms and legs and used a wheelchair for that reason. And I was watching it in the context of having been thinking a lot about people living with disabilities and the independent living movement, which is the work my dad did as a kid. And I wrote a piece about it on the show recently. And I thought how easily and clearly it seemed to come to this man, Fred Rogers, to relate to this child on his own terms as a human being. Mm-hmm. Which is, for many people living with disabilities, like exactly all they're asking for.
He did it. I mean, Fred never liked to use the term disability. He said the people with disabilities are the people who aren't in touch with their own emotional self, which is a very Fred Rogers thing to say. He would say special needs if he had to, but he had many children of special needs on the program year after year and visit the set and everything else. But that Jeffrey Erlinger, the boy you're talking about, which is such an incredible clip and one of his all-time favorite moments in the history of the show.
It's you I like. It's not the things you wear. It's not the way you do your hair. But it's you I like. The way you are right now. The way down deep inside you. Not the things that hide you. Not your fancy chair. That's just beside you. But it's you I like. every part of you. Your skin, your eyes, your feelings, whether old or new. It's you I like. And it is you I like, Jeff.
Thanks.
And there must be times when you do feel blue.
Uh-huh.
I'm not feeling blue right now, though.
Me neither.
I'm so glad that you came today.
Thanks.
But Jeffrey's family, his parents and his sister, who I just met in Seattle at a screening, who came, and it was like this amazing. She brought her whole family and Jeffrey's niece and nephews. She said when they first met, Fred had actually come to Milwaukee, which was near their home in Wisconsin. And this long before Jeff went on the show, because Jeff had written a letter and Fred was touring, and he made sure they had a breakfast together. And so Fred came, and as he met Jeff and Jeff's sister, without anybody asking, without asking permission, he, as he was talking to Jeff, cut Jeff's pancakes and started feeding Jeff as they were talking. And that's something their family had done for him their whole lives. And no outsider had ever done that before for Jeff. And without even having to ask, Fred knew what that would mean. And then Jeff's sister said, and then Fred went out of his way to talk to me because he knew having a sibling who needed that much attention could be very hard on her. And so he made sure to really give her focus and attention. And this all happened kind of invisibly. And it speaks volumes to how in tune Fred was with what every child needed out of every situation. And it's something he did again and again. I mean, I'm getting chills just thinking about it.
I mean, it also speaks to how deeply and sincerely committed he was to engaging human beings on an individual human level. The way that he relates to a kid with a serious physical disability neither ignores that defining fact of that kid's life, nor allows it to be the sole defining fact of that kid's life, right?
Absolutely.
In the same way that, you talk with Francois Clemens, who's played Officer Clemens on the show, and he is both black and gay. And you can see how deeply grateful he was to have had a person in his life, especially coming from the context that Fred Rogers, Fred Rogers is the squarest white guy.
Yeah, and he was a
minister.
Rich kid minister from Latrobe, Pennsylvania. And Francois was a very poor kid who grew up in a broken house in Youngstown, Ohio, who happened to be an amazing singer and ended up studying opera in Pittsburgh, which is how he met Fred. And Fred recruited him to come onto the show shortly after Martin Luther King's assassination and to say, we need an integrated neighborhood, and that person of color should be the policeman in the neighborhood, which was all, there was nothing accidental about these decisions that Fred made. But Francois, Francois said, well, Fred was a good listener and I was a really good talker. And Francois said, Fred didn't understand about being poor or about being black. And I really talked to him about those things to help him understand what those meant. And Fred was dying to learn those things. He really wanted to understand what those things meant and then address them in the show. And I think that was part of what he was doing always, was trying to understand a broader world. He was a seeker, without a doubt. He was trying to learn everything and understand different points of view, and then bring those to bear in the neighborhood. And it wasn't easy, and he made mistakes, and he was riddled with doubt. There's an aspect of Fred that's like a tortured artist. But I think that understanding the human struggle that went into what he was doing makes you appreciate even more what it was that he did do.
What was Fred Rogers' relationship with the fact that Francois Clemens was gay? He was hired on the show that at the end of the 1960s. Right?
Yeah, so the summer of '68, Francois started. And Fred knew pretty early on that Francois was gay. And Francois was married for a short time, unsuccessfully, of course, as he says in the film. And Fred didn't know how to handle it. He knew Francois was gay. I think Fred didn't yet understand really what that meant. And when Francois wanted to come out in the early 70s, Fred told him he couldn't. And I think that's a decision he regretted. I think he would have made a different decision later. And he ended up being a huge advocate for homosexual rights, and in the church and out of the church and elsewhere, Pittsburgh, and moving to a much more progressive church that actually openly welcomed homosexuals into the congregation. So I think it's part of a process he went through of trying to grow. And that's something that was never talked about publicly. But it was something that I think he was on this journey to understand. And I think when he came to understand the pain it caused Francois, that was a key for him to understand that his beliefs were secondary to the pain and the fear and the insecurity, because that was the language that Fred spoke first. So he did change, because I think fundamentally he was focused on what makes us full of love and less full of hate, and everything else was secondary.
Why did Fred Rogers dedicate his life to healing other people's pain?
Well, I think it's got to get back to his own childhood. I mean, somebody wouldn't be so focused on children and trying to heal people emotionally if they weren't themselves unhealed in some way. I mean, Fred, on the surface of things, just to talk about his childhood for a second, he grew up an only child to an affluent family, and he loved his parents, but his parents were of a very different parenting generation that weren't comfortable with emotions. And Fred was sickly, he was overweight, and he also came of age during the Lindbergh kidnapping as a young boy, which is in the wake of Charles Lindbergh's son being kidnapped. Basically, a lot of affluent families said, we don't want that to happen to us. We're going to lock our kids away. So Fred was kind of kept under latchkey for quite a bit. These very protective, very kind of emotionally distant parents who didn't want him to ever show emotion. And I think that had an incredibly profound impact on him of just not knowing what to do with his fear or with his sense of how he belonged in the world. I think what started to change is his parents adopted his sister when he was 12. She was a baby. And so he then, as a 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old, had a front row seat to see a baby grow and to see what that meant. And so he not only remembered his own childhood, he witnessed firsthand his sister coming of age. And in those years, as he made it into high school, he blossomed. He became a great musician, songwriter, a mimic, a popular person in the class. By his senior year, he was the class president. And skinny, as you see, and it kind of became the person who Fred was. But he had to go through this kind of chrysalis phase of a lot of darkness And I think he made it his life's mission to try and erase that type of darkness from as many other people's lives as he could. Yeah, I'm not sure if that totally answers your question, but it's a tough thing to figure out what made him that way.
I want to play this clip from 1969 that's in your film. And so President Johnson had established public broadcasting a few years earlier, and it was in the late 1960s under threat for a variety of reasons, but under very sincere threat, because it was not, this was a time before they could do what they usually do, which is just bring Big Bird to Capitol Hill.
Yeah, but Big Bird wasn't out yet.
Yeah.
Sesame Street was starting at this moment.
And this is Mr. Rogers testifying before this committee hearing that's going to decide what to do about the future of public broadcasting. And he has been asked not to read the statement that he had prepared, and in fact kind of mocked from the podium for suggesting that he might read his statement. And so he's speaking extemporaneously, and he recites the lyrics of a song he wrote for the show.
This has to do with that good feeling of control, which I feel that children need to know is there. And it starts out, what do you do with the mad that you feel? And that first line came straight from a child. I work with children, doing puppets in very personal communication with small groups. What do you do with the mad that you feel? When you feel so mad you could bite. When the whole wide world seems oh so wrong, and nothing you do seems very right. It's great to be able to stop when you've planned a thing that's wrong, and be able to do something else instead, and think this song. I can stop when I want to, can stop when I wish, can stop, anytime. Know that there's something deep inside that helps us become what we can.
I think it's wonderful. I think it's wonderful. Looks like you just earned the $20 million.
Well, congratulations, it happened. I started crying.
It's amazing. What you hear in that is that here's, a tough-nosed senator, John Pastore of Rhode Island, who is about to read the riot act to Fred Rogers, and Fred doesn't change. He's as he always is. I think how rare that is, that somebody in the face of that could be as vulnerable as he was to read those lyrics and to be as available as he was there. And the reaction he gets is incredible, but it shows that he was willing to put himself out there in this way that you just don't see. And that I find so inspiring.
I mean, it's so incredible to see anyone who is able to be that kind of leader without making their work about themselves. I mean, it's like overwhelming to watch and listen to. That's not a question.
No, it's well, I thought a lot about this lately. I keep coming back to the idea of grace, because Fred talked about grace all the time. And grace, he had a sign in his office that was the Greek word for grace, which is chari, which is the root of the word charity. And grace is the idea in the biblical term that it's the undeserved goodness bestowed upon you by God. So in other words, it's the goodness you put out there, even if it's not deserved. It's not because you're getting something back. It's not even because it's a nice thing to do. Or that the person is deserving. It's even if they don't deserve it, you are kind to them. And that sense of selflessness of putting that much good out there with no sense of what do I get out of it is so rare in this day and age. I don't see it in our politics. I don't see it in our economics. It's rare to see in our media. You know, we live in a culture that is so, that feels so alien, and that it's just tough. I mean, we live in disgraceful times. You know, how do we remind ourselves that to be graceful is not, it's not a virtue, it's a duty. You know, that it's something that we have to try and live up to, because that's how we're going to be able to move forward. Because otherwise it feels like we're getting pretty stuck. I mean, it's really hard not to be judgmental in the world. And Fred often quoted the Bible, where he quotes Jesus in the Bible saying, the one thing that evil cannot tolerate is forgiveness. And even in the PSA we have in the film, in the wake of 9/11, he says the three most important things we have to keep in our mind at a moment like that are the ideas of faith, pardon, and love. Not many people were immediately talking about pardon in the wake of 9/11, but I feel like this sense of forgiveness and pardon and understanding is really difficult to do, but that's what I think Fred would be doing today. You know, I think that was in his bones of, like, it's what I try and think about in terms of how to process the world we're in today. You know, how do we understand it, not how do we condemn it? Because if we don't understand it, we're not going to fix it.
Morgan Neville, thank you for coming on Bullseye. Thank you for your beautiful film. And I'm sorry that instead of asking you questions, I just said stuff and tried not to cry.
It's great talking to you.
It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood, a neighborly day.
Jesse Thorn talking with Morgan Neville. Morgan's movie, Won't You Be My Neighbor, is in theaters now.
I have always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. I've always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you. So let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're together, we might as well say, would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Won't you please? Won't you please? Please won't you be my neighbor?